We're going to take a look at a few different options that I've come up with today, all at a lower price point than the Nintendo Switch Pro controller that I recommend for a variety of different reasons. If I'm being honest, I have a few issues myself with the Nintendo Switch Pro controller, and I understand that I'm in the minority because I've only ever heard people say good things about this thing. But full disclaimer, as we're going through the rest of this video, I am a doghead apologist. The reason for this is that if I'm going to spend $70 on a Pro controller, I need it to do more than what the Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons can do for spending $10 more on them. I'd rather spend the $80 and get a new set of Joy-Cons and have a more versatile controller. And if feeling comfortable is like the only thing that it has going for it, I don't think that a $70 price point is justifiable, and I think there are some more options that we should take a look at. So here are 3 controllers that I took a deep dive into to see if they're worth the money and if they solve problems that the Pro controller doesn't. And before we continue into reviewing these 3, if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, like it, subscribe, share it with a friend. Let me know in the comments if you found it helpful and what controller you ended up purchasing. The PowerA wireless controller for the Nintendo Switch is probably the cheapest option that I would say you should take a look at. If you're in the market for an affordable controller, this is probably something that you're going to want to pick up. It starts at around $15 right now when I checked on Amazon, and I think that's a little bit cheaper than what I actually got it for. And if we're being honest, I probably would have passed on this one if it didn't come bundled in with my Nintendo Switch when they were difficult to get during the summer. GameStop was selling a bundle package, and this came with it, and so I figured, hey, why not give it a shot? And I was actually surprised by how good this thing was. For a $15 controller, this thing does what it's supposed to do without feeling like you've compromised $55. Sure, there are some flaws with it, and I wasn't actually even planning on getting one of these ever because I automatically wrote it off at that price point. It's also wired, and that might be a deal breaker for some people. You have to plug it into the back of your Nintendo Switch docks, which means that you can't use it in handheld mode. For a $15 controller, this does not feel like you're making a $55 compromise from the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. Sure, it's wired, and that might be a convenience thing that is a deal breaker for some people, but if you're looking for an extra controller to have around for when you guys are playing Smash or when you want to play 4-player Mario Kart and you don't want to split apart the Joy-Con, because let's be honest, who wants to use that right Joy-Con to control anything where you have to move your thumb over like 8 miles to get to the analog stick? The cord itself is detachable, and it's 10 feet long, which is really awesome, so you don't feel like you're tethered to your TV in the days of like old console games where you maybe only had like a 2-foot cord. Okay, for a $15 controller, I was expecting there to be way more cons than there really are. And what I found is a lot of the cons aren't straight up cons. They're actually things that some people may like if you're in the minority. Some of these things that some people may love and some people may hate are things that stray a bit from the Pro controller. Things like the analog sticks being larger and the place where you rest your thumb on them being extremely wide. They're way more loose than the Joy-Con or even something like a DualShock or a DualSense controller. They feel a bit more sensitive, but at the same time, they feel a bit more unwieldy and unpredictable. Kind of like if you have the sensitivity setting turned all the way up without actually have to doing that in any video game software. Another thing that a lot of people might like about this is that there's no motion controls and no rumble features. So if you're like me, and as soon as you turn on any game, you go into the settings and you turn off motion controls and the rumble settings, then this is probably going to be a controller for you because you're not making a sacrifice in that area and you're not paying for something that you're not going to use. Now, there are some games that do heavily feature the rumble and motion features, so you may actually have to like take your Joy-Con out and put them in doghead mode to get through that part of the game. But not all of these cons could be spun as positives. The controller feels like it's made out of cheap plastic, and with some rage pressure, it feels like you could do some real damage. The buttons also have a lot of travel time, and while I don't like my buttons to actuate instantly as if like you kind of breathed on them and you're pressing buttons, this is way too much for my liking. Also, the D-pad is just It's not horrible, but it's not the best one I've ever felt. Overall, for $15, this is way better than it has any right to be, and you should probably pick one up if you need a 3rd or 4th controller. Okay, moving on from the $15 PowerA controller for the Nintendo Switch, we have the GameCube style controller for the Nintendo Switch, which is also made by PowerA. Go figure. This wireless controller comes in at $50, and if you've been a fan for Nintendo for a while, you'll know that the GameCube style controller is not just for nostalgia, but it's still a lot of people's preferred way to play Super Smash Bros. Now, I know somebody is already screaming at me,
saying, "You can't recommend a wireless controller for Smash Brothers!"
To which my reply is, yes, I can. Now, latency on any wireless controller is a real thing. And if you're already sitting there cringing that I recommended a wireless controller because you want to play Smash, then this controller already isn't for you. But for everybody else, it's still a perfectly acceptable option. It's about the same amount of lag as any other wireless controller. In fact, I think it's even a little bit better than using the doghead style controller in terms of its latency. But it's not something that you won't be able to adjust for. So all of that being said, I would totally recommend checking this one out if you just want a nostalgic feel and some quality of life improvements for your Nintendo GameCube style of controller. The pros here are that this is a totally acceptable controller for $50, and you might even be able to find them at a little bit cheaper price point if you're not looking for some of those classic colorways like the purple. The other great feature that this has is that it has your plus and minus buttons as well as the screenshot and home button, so it's fully compatible with the Switch. In addition to that, it also has a left Z bumper that the original GameCube controller did not. And because of that and the addition of motion controls, it makes this a passable controller for playing other games besides Super Smash Bros. If you're looking for a way to feel nostalgic while you're playing 3D platformers. So, for example, if you're a fan of Super Mario Sunshine on the GameCube, definitely use this when playing Sunshine in the 3D All-Stars pack. It runs on 2 AA batteries, which, not being a rechargeable battery, is a little bit of a meh, but you can insert your own rechargeable batteries if you have them. So the triggers have a decent amount of travel before they actuate, which is the biggest flaw of this controller, in my opinion. Another thing is that the analog stick feels a little bit smaller in terms of surface area, as well as taller in terms of height than I remember it being on the GameCube controller. If you're looking for a cheaper option or a wired version, there actually is a wired version that comes in at a lower price point than this. So I would definitely recommend giving this one a shot and then flipping it online if you end up not liking it. Next up, we have the SN30 Pro Plus made by bitdo. And this takes the Super Nintendo controller and kind of gives it a quality of life update. So I personally thought that the Super Nintendo controller is the perfect controller in terms of button layout and feel and D-pad placement for games where a D-pad is the primary means of control. And I say thought because I didn't think that we would ever get anyone going back and updating this controller. But we did, and bitdo took a DualShock 4 and a Super Nintendo controller and fused it together and took the best out of both of those and gave us this controller. If you're looking to play some 2D platform games, retro games, anything on the Nintendo Online service, or you want a controller that feels more like a DualShock controller because you're a PlayStation fan, then you can use this to play any video game you want on your Nintendo Switch. Like I said, it feels like a Super Nintendo controller was redesigned for modern players. It's easy to pair. It uses USB Type-C to charge the controller that has a rechargeable battery. It feels the way that your brain remembers the Super Nintendo controller to play, which means that they went in there and did a lot of fine tuning to make that happen. The buttons save the SNES 2 concave and 2 convex buttons for the A, B, and XY buttons, which is awesome in my opinion, and I miss this feature because you can kind of feel where you're at without having to look at the controller. The addition of the triggers makes this a completely practical way to play some new modern games. Like I said, if you're looking for the symmetrical analog stick controller layout. So if you're a fan of like PlayStation controller layouts, this is for you to give a shot playing games like Breath of the Wild maybe. So you can even go in and adjust some of these trigger settings as well. You can make them more sensitive if you want. There are also macro buttons that you can program. And if you're unfamiliar, macro is just saying, hey, I want to assign a combination of button inputs to one action. So you end up pressing fewer amount of buttons. So let's say you're playing Street Fighter and you want to pre-program your Hadoukens in there because you just can't get them down. You can totally do that on this control, but it's also kind of cheating. So along with that, you can also map the buttons differently. So if you're a bumper jumper type of person, you can totally do that as well. And finally, one of the biggest things it has going for it is that you can take this controller and play it on your PS4 or your Xbox and your computer, your Mac. You can play it almost wherever, and if you can't figure out a way to pair it via Bluetooth, you can always buy an adapter to make it work with your system. Now, there aren't too many cons that I could think of besides that the analog sticks feel a little bit stiff. There's no NFC support, and motion and rumble controls are just okay. All things considered, it's definitely hard for me to not recommend picking up an SN30 Pro Plus if you're playing on the Nintendo Switch, especially if you want a properly placed D-pad. Whether it's price, function, form, or versatility, I hope that I gave you something to consider when looking for an alternative to a Nintendo Switch Pro controller that you may not have thought about before. Now, let me know in the comments what controller you end up picking up, and if this video was helpful for you and your family in terms of picking out another controller for your Nintendo Switch setup. If you like this video, thumbs up. If you disliked it, hit a dislike button. Share it with a friend if you think they like it, and if you're subscribed, I'll see you on the next one. Bye, guys.